My brother tore up months of my Chinese study materials in our backyard, scattering the pieces while I cried. When I tried to stand up for myself, he pointed at me and said, "Starting tomorrow, you'll be spending your nights in a diner." I just stared at him. That was 6 months ago. This morning, he was standing outside my apartment in tears. My older brother said I was mocking his disability by learning a second language, and our parents took his side. Growing up, my brother Bryce was always this extremely happy kid with an extremely low IQ. He'd laugh about spelling his name wrong and make fun of himself for still taking Algebra 1 in senior year. But then he failed to even graduate. Suddenly, he became convinced that intelligence was his enemy, and anyone learning something was mocking him. Our grandmother used to play these brain training games on our computer, and Bryce turned it off right as she was hitting her high score. He even binned our 7-year-old cousin's Scrabble set that she got for Christmas after losing to her. And when I started learning Chinese to impress my crush, I became his next target. I tried to be understanding at first. I wouldn't practice in front of him and watch the videos with headphones on, but that wasn't enough. He'd heard my Duolingo notifications and start breaking into tantrums, saying I was showing off to make him feel stupid. I tried explaining it was for a girl, but he insisted foreign languages were my way of rubbing my working brain in his face. Soon, he started isolating parts of the house. The living and dining rooms became a Chinese-free zone, because that's where he needed to decompress after his shift as the door opener at Kroger. I was a little annoyed, but just moved everything to my bedroom. Door closed, headphones on. Surely this was now fine and I could practice my Chinese in peace, right? Wrong. Before I knew it, Bryce started documenting my study sessions in a headache journal, claiming the Chinese that was coming through the walls triggered migraines. He'd text Mom pictures of himself holding his head when I was practicing. I told him I was using headphones and just writing, not even speaking, but he said just knowing that I'm mocking his disabilities was triggering. And because Bryce was my parents' special little boy, they took his side. Dad pulled me aside and said, "Your brother has challenges you'll never understand. Is impressing some girl really worth making him feel worthless?" Mom was even worse. She acted like I was torturing him on purpose, suggesting I learn Chinese at the library because family comes first, and will knowing a few phrases really be the difference between getting rejected and her saying yes. I tried to stand my ground, but before I knew it, I was sitting in our back garden learning Chinese because it was the only way Bryce felt included. But I actually liked the garden. It was springtime, meaning it got warm, and the sound of wind made me focus better. But then Bryce got fired from his job as door opener. It was the only job he'd ever held. He stormed into the back garden the day of and started tearing my printouts apart. I tried to push him away, but he was 6 inches taller and 5 years older and knocked me to the ground. He destroyed all my material right there on the spot. I was still outside crying when I heard him inside the house arguing with Mom. "It's his fault I lost the job, Mom. The joke I made at the Chinese customer was because of the Chinese he's learning." I saw Mom hesitating, but then minutes later she was coming out. "Bryce is right, honey. Your crush isn't worth destroying your brother's livelihood." I stared at her in disbelief as she knelt down and helped me pick up what was left of my material. All forms of Chinese studying were now banned from our living area during Bryce's waking hours. "It's okay," Mom said. "You can practice from 5 to 6 a.m. before school." I remember waking up at 4:45 a.m. for the next 3 days, sitting at the table learning through my apps. I was sleep deprived and my head hurt from staring at the screen in darkness. Lights on anywhere in the house before waking time triggered Bryce. And on day 4, Bryce had a complete meltdown at breakfast. Apparently, now just knowing I was learning Chinese while he slept gave him nightmares about being too stupid to exist. He demanded I leave the house entirely if I wanted to practice. "Go to that 24-hour diner if Chinese matters so much," he said. My parents barely looked up from their plate. I could tell they were content to be just bystanders. "Starting tomorrow, you'll be—" Bryce was speaking as if it was already determined I'd be spending my nights in a diner. I cut him off mid-sentence. "Shut up, I'm not going!" He stared at me like I had multiple heads. "What did you just— Do you have any idea why I'm learning Chinese?" I cut him off again. "Yeah, it's for that little crush of yours." "Not just that," I said, with this look that I could tell made him skeptical. I raised my voice. "This was never about making you feel stupid, Bryce." "Yes, it— Would you listen for once in your life?" I interrupted for the 3rd time now. "Lynn's dad owns a gaming company," I said. My voice was shaking. "He literally only hires family friends because he trusts them more than random applications. You sit here every single night saying you'd kill for a gaming job, talking about how you know every game, every developer, every piece of industry news." Bryce's face was changing. "If I dated Lynn, you'd be at family dinners. You'd be at barbecues. Her dad would meet you, see how passionate you are about gaming, and probably offer you something. But now," I looked him straight in the eyes, "now I'm never mentioning your name. And when her dad asks about my family, which he will, I'm telling him exactly what kind of person my brother is. Someone who'd rather destroy my first relationship than let me be happy. Someone who weaponizes his disability to control everyone around him." The silence was deafening. Mom's fork stopped halfway to her mouth and she put it back down on her plate. She shifted in her chair and looked between me and Bryce before finally asking if what I said about the gaming company was true. The words came out slow like she was testing each one. Bryce didn't answer her. He just pulled out his phone and started scrolling through one of his games, the one where you match colored blocks that he played for hours every night. His breathing got heavy, and I could see his hands gripping the phone so tight his knuckles went white. Nobody said anything for the rest of dinner. I went to bed that night thinking maybe I'd finally gotten through to them. The next morning I woke up to find Bryce sitting on the floor outside my bedroom door with that stupid headache journal in his lap. He looked up when I opened the door and said he wanted to talk, but his voice was different, like he was asking instead of telling. I stepped over him and headed downstairs, but he scrambled up and followed me. He kept talking as we went down the stairs, saying he'd been up all night looking at the gaming company's website. They were hiring junior game testers and you didn't need a degree, just passion and knowledge about games. His voice cracked when he said he had both of those things. I went to the kitchen and grabbed a bowl from the cabinet and the cereal from the pantry. Bryce stood in the doorway watching me pour the milk, waiting for me to say something. After everything he'd put me through for months, him suddenly wanting my help felt wrong. I finally asked what his point was. He took a step into the kitchen and the words seemed to hurt him when he said he needed me to introduce him to Lynn's dad. He actually said, "Please." Mom came into the kitchen then, and she looked terrible with dark circles under her eyes. She said she hadn't slept either because she kept thinking about what I'd said about destroying my first relationship. I turned to face both of them while holding my cereal bowl. I told them it wasn't just about the relationship, but about respect, because I was 16, not 6, and deserved to pursue my interest without being sabotaged. Bryce slammed his journal down on the counter so hard the salt shaker jumped. He shouted that fine. The headaches were fake, and he'd made it all up because he was jealous. Even he looked surprised that he'd said it out loud. Dad appeared in the doorway, already dressed in his work clothes with his tie done up and his briefcase in his hand. He said he'd heard what Bryce just admitted, and that we'd all be discussing this tonight when he got home from work. The rest of that morning was weird, with Bryce avoiding eye contact and Mom making breakfast in complete silence, while Dad had already left for the office early. I grabbed my backpack and headed to school where I found Alexander standing by my locker scrolling through his phone. He looked up and immediately noticed the bags under my eyes. I told him everything about Bryce, finally admitting he'd been faking the headaches and how Dad actually heard him confess it. Alexander shook his head and asked if my parents would finally do something about it. I shrugged while grabbing my history textbook because honestly I had no idea what would happen. But Mom had seemed different last night, like maybe she was finally seeing what had been going on. We were about to head to first period when Lynn appeared at my locker holding her Chinese workbook. She smiled and said she'd heard I was learning Chinese, which was really cool, and asked if I wanted to practice together at lunch. My heart started pounding so hard I thought she might hear it, but I managed to nod and tell her I'd like that. Alexander grinned and made some excuse about needing to get to class early before walking away to give us space. This was exactly what I'd been working toward all those mornings studying in the dark, and all those hours in the garden before Bryce destroyed my materials. Lynn and I talked for another minute about which apps we were using before the warning bell rang, and we had to split up for class. The whole day dragged on with me barely able to focus on anything except lunch with Lynn and whatever whatever Dad had planned for tonight. When I finally got home that evening, Dad was already there with his tie loosened and sleeves rolled up, sitting in the living room with Mom and Bryce. Why did Bryce think his joke about Chinese customers was connected to his brother learning the language? That jump in logic is so strange, like he's looking for anything to blame except himself. The room that used to be Bryce's Chinese free zone now felt like a courtroom with Dad sitting forward in his chair, looking more serious than I'd ever seen him. He started by saying that Bryce had admitted to faking his symptoms, which was manipulation and abuse. The word abuse hung in the air like something toxic, because we'd never used that word in our family before. Bryce's face turned red, and he jumped up from the couch yelling that he was the one with the disability, and he was the one who couldn't learn things like I could while pointing at me like I was the criminal here. Mom finally spoke up in this quiet voice saying that having a disability didn't give him the right to control others, and that she thought she'd been enabling him. I couldn't help the bitter laugh that escaped when I reminded her she'd made me study Chinese at 5 in the morning in complete darkness, because Bryce claimed he was having nightmares about it. 3 days later, Bryce had gone completely quiet and spent most of his time locked in his room with his laptop, which was weird because he usually watched TV in the living room from morning to night. Mom would bring him meals on a tray, but she wasn't doing the whole cutting his food into bite-sized pieces thing anymore, just left the plate by his door and walked away. I could hear him typing away at all hours, printing stuff out on our old printer that made this awful grinding noise every time it spit out a page. At school, Lynn and I had started meeting up during lunch to practice Chinese together, sitting under the big oak tree behind the cafeteria where nobody really went. She'd bring these flashcards her mom had made, and we'd quiz each other while eating our sandwiches, and she was way better than me, but never made me feel dumb about it. One day she mentioned her dad was looking for game testers for their new project, asking if I knew anyone who was really passionate about gaming. I froze with my sandwich halfway to my mouth because of course I knew someone, but part of me wanted to say no, wanted to punish Bryce for everything he'd put me through. But then I thought about what it could mean for our family if he actually got a job he cared about, how maybe things could change. That Friday night after dinner, I was heading to my room when Bryce cornered me in the hallway, shoving this thick stack of papers at me that he'd clearly spent hours putting together. The portfolio had every single game Miller Interactive had ever made with detailed analysis, screenshots he'd printed in color, even though Mom always yelled about ink costs, and these long paragraphs about game mechanics and story development. I flipped through page after page, shocked at how good it actually was, how he'd noticed things about the games I'd never even thought about despite playing some of them myself. He stood there watching me read, shifting his weight from foot to foot like a little kid waiting for test results. When I looked up at him, he said quietly that he wasn't stupid about everything, just most things, and it was the most vulnerable I'd ever seen him in my entire life. The next week I finally mentioned Bryce to Lynn while we were practicing, carefully telling her my brother was obsessed with her dad's games and actually knew more about them than anyone I'd ever met. She immediately perked up, saying her dad loved meeting true fans, and maybe Bryce could come to their weekend barbecue. When I got home and told Bryce about the invitation, his eyes actually filled with tears, and he kept asking if I was really doing this for him after everything that had happened. I told him I was doing it because it was the right thing to do, but made it clear that if he embarrassed me or made any comments about Chinese people, we were done forever, and he nodded so hard I thought his head might fall off. The day of the barbecue came way faster than I expected, and Bryce spent the entire morning in his room trying on different shirts. I could hear him through the wall practicing conversation starters with Mom, who kept telling him to just relax and be himself. She helped him pick out his nicest jeans, and even ironed his favorite gaming shirt that had some retro controller design on it. They spent almost 3 hours going over topics he could talk about if the conversation got awkward. When we finally got in the car to drive to Lynn's house, Bryce's hands were shaking so bad he couldn't even buckle his seatbelt properly. The whole ride there, he kept asking me what if questions about messing up or saying something dumb. We pulled up to this huge house with perfect grass and a 3-car garage, and Bryce just froze in the passenger seat. He wouldn't get out of the car for like 5 whole minutes and kept saying maybe this was a bad idea. His usual confidence where he'd boss everyone around was completely gone, and he looked like a scared little kid. I told him to just be the version of himself who loves games, not the version who tears up homework. He nodded and finally got out, but his legs were shaking as we walked up the driveway. Lynn answered the door with this huge smile and led us through to the backyard where her dad was grilling burgers. Mr. Johnson turned around with this warm smile and shook both our hands like we were important business partners or something. The second Bryce mentioned he'd beaten every achievement in their latest game, Mr. Johnson's whole face lit up. He started asking Bryce about specific mechanics and boss fights, and Bryce just came alive talking about frame rates and difficulty curves. All that stuttering and nervousness disappeared as he explained his strategy for the final boss that apparently only 2% of players had beaten. Mr. Johnson was leaning in, asking follow-up questions, and even called over some other guy who worked at the company to hear Bryce's analysis. They stood there for like an hour straight just talking about game design and player retention rates and stuff I didn't even understand. Lynn grabbed my hand and we went to get food while they kept talking by the grill. 2 hours into the party, I looked across the yard and Bryce was still deep in conversation with Mr. Johnson and 2 other employees. Lynn squeezed my hand and said my brother really knew his stuff, which made me feel weird because I'd never heard anyone compliment him before. We stayed until almost 9, and when we got home, Mom was waiting in the living room asking how it went. Bryce couldn't stop talking about how Mr. Johnson wanted to see his portfolio of game reviews he'd been writing. Mom actually started crying on the phone when she called me later that evening, saying Bryce hadn't been this happy in years. She kept thanking me for giving him this chance and saying maybe things could finally turn around for our family. I felt this weird mix of being happy for him, but also still mad about all the months of hell he'd put me through. I told her he needed to earn this opportunity and that one good day didn't erase what he did to me. She got quiet and said she understood, but I could tell she just wanted everything to go back to normal. The next morning, I was barely awake when Bryce burst into my room without even knocking. He was holding his phone and practically jumping up and down, saying Mr. Johnson had emailed him about taking a real test. Not just a conversation, but an actual game knowledge test that could lead to an internship at the company. His excitement was so intense I thought he might pass out from not breathing properly between words. I told him that was great, but made sure to remind him this all came through my relationship with Lynn, the relationship he tried to destroy when he ripped up my Chinese homework and got me banned from studying in my own house. His face went from pure joy to something I'd never seen on him before, like actual shame was hitting him for the first time. He sat down on the couch and put his head in his hands, stayed quiet for maybe 30 seconds, which was the longest I'd ever seen him go without talking. When he looked up, his eyes were wet, and he asked me how he could make things right. I didn't have an answer ready because honestly, I never expected him to care about making anything right. Over the next week, something weird happened in our house. Bryce started studying for that test like his life depended on it, but not in his usual way where everyone had to suffer with him. He wore headphones, kept normal hours, didn't demand we all be silent when he was working. He'd set up at the kitchen table with his laptop and notebooks, writing down everything he knew about different game studios and their histories. Mom kept bringing him snacks and drinks, but he'd just nod and keep working, not making a big deal about needing special treatment. Dad noticed it first, pulled me aside one evening while Bryce was in his room reviewing his notes. He told me it was like having a different son, and that he should have stepped in years ago instead of letting things get so bad. The apology felt weird coming from him after all this time, but I could see he meant it. 3 days before the test, Bryce started getting nervous, pacing around the house and asking me questions about what Mr. Johnson might ask him. The morning of the test, he threw up twice before breakfast. Couldn't keep anything down. Hands shaking so bad Mom had to button his shirt for him. He kept asking what would happen if he failed, if he was too stupid even for this chance. I told him he wasn't stupid about games, that Mr. Johnson had seen that already, and to just trust what he knew. The words felt strange coming out of my mouth after everything he'd put me through, but I meant them. He left for the test looking like he might pass out but determined. The next 2 weeks waiting for results were the strangest our family had ever been. Bryce was anxious but not mean about it, didn't take it out on anyone, just kept refreshing his email every 10 minutes. Bryce spent 3 hours practicing conversation topics with their mom before the barbecue. That's such careful preparation preparation for someone who usually just demands things. How did his brain switch from memorizing game details to remembering social rules? Mom supported him without babying him for once, telling him whatever happened, they were proud he tried. Dad actually sat at dinner with us and asked about everyone's day, instead of hiding in his office. At school, things were good too. Lynn and I were officially together and everyone knew it. Alexander kept joking that I'd turned family dysfunction into a relationship strategy, but he wasn't completely wrong about that. Lynn thought the whole situation with Bryce was crazy, but she was glad something good might come from it. Mrs. Rodriguez pulled me aside between classes one day, said my teachers had noticed I seemed happier lately and wanted to check if everything was okay at home. She'd been worried about me since sophomore year when I'd shown up to school exhausted from those early morning study sessions. I told her things were actually getting better, and she looked genuinely relieved. 2 weeks and 3 days after the test, we were all at dinner when Bryce's phone buzzed. He grabbed it so fast he knocked over his water glass, hands shaking worse than test day. He tried to open the email but couldn't manage it, shoved the phone at Mom and asked her to read it. She opened it and started reading out loud about how they were pleased to offer him a position in their game testing department. Bryce completely lost it, started sobbing harder than I'd seen since he was maybe 8 years old. He kept saying he got it, that someone actually wanted him for his brain, not despite it. Mom was crying too. Dad got up and actually hugged him, which I hadn't seen in years. Even I felt something in my chest watching him realize he was worth something to someone who wasn't family. Dad went straight to the kitchen and came back with a bottle of champagne we'd been saving since New Year's, popping it right there in the living room while Mom kept wiping tears from her face and pulling Bryce into these tight hugs every few minutes. Bryce sat on the couch reading that offer letter again and again, his finger tracing each line like he was scared the words might change if he looked away, and I watched him mouth the salary number at least 20 times before Dad poured everyone a glass, even giving me half of one. The whole thing felt like watching a different family, like aliens had replaced the people I'd lived with for years, because Dad was actually talking about Bryce's future, and Mom was making plans for his first day, instead of just worrying about his feelings. We stayed up until almost midnight talking about the job, about gaming, about everything except Chinese or disabilities or any of the stuff that had torn us apart for months. Around 11 that night, I was already in bed when I heard the knock on my door, soft at first, then a bit louder, and when I opened it, Bryce was standing there looking more uncomfortable than I'd ever seen him, shifting his weight and staring at the floor. He started talking fast, saying he'd been jealous of everything about me, not just the Chinese, but how I learned stuff without trying, made friends without thinking about it, did all the things that felt impossible for him. His voice cracked when he admitted he'd wanted to punish me for being everything he couldn't be, for having the brain that worked right, for making him feel broken just by existing. I told him I knew, that I'd figured it out months ago, but knowing why didn't make it okay that he'd made my life hell, destroyed my stuff, gotten me kicked out of my own house at 5 in the morning. He nodded and pulled out his phone, showing me a shopping cart full of Chinese learning books and apps he'd been researching, saying he wanted to use his first paycheck to replace everything he destroyed, and maybe I could teach him some basic phrases for work since there might be Chinese clients. The next 2 weeks passed in this weird adjustment period where Bryce would practice saying hello and thank you in Chinese while getting ready for work, wearing his new more interactive t-shirt around the house like it was made of gold. Mom started telling him no for the first time I could remember. Like when he wanted to skip his first team meeting, she made him go anyway, and Dad actually stayed in the room during family dinners instead of disappearing to his office. Everything felt different but fragile, like we were all learning how to be a family again. And when Alexander came over 3 weeks later, he stopped in the doorway and looked around like he'd walked into the wrong house. He kept saying the place felt different, lighter somehow, like everyone could finally breathe without worrying about setting off a bomb, and even pointed out that I was doing my Chinese homework at the kitchen table instead of hiding. Things were going well until about a month into the job when Bryce came home early one Tuesday, looking like someone had died, his face white and his hands shaking as he told us he'd made a huge mistake in testing that might get him fired. He'd missed a major bug because he'd been showing off to his team lead about knowing some obscure game mechanic, got distracted and approved something that crashed the whole system, costing them hours of work. But instead of throwing things or screaming or blaming me somehow, he sat at the table and asked what he should do, how he could fix it, how he could show them he could learn from mistakes, instead of just being the stupid kid who broke everything. I grabbed my laptop and sat next to him at the kitchen table, something that would have been impossible just months ago. We spent the next hour typing and retyping his email to his supervisor, me showing him how to take responsibility without sounding pathetic, how to propose solutions instead of just apologizing. His hands were shaking as he typed, but he kept going, asking me to check his spelling, his tone, if he sounded too stupid. When he finally hit send, he stared at the screen like he was waiting for the world to end. The next morning, his supervisor called while I was eating breakfast, and Bryce put it on speaker without asking, his face white as paper. Mr. Smith's voice filled our kitchen, and I watched Bryce's jaw drop when instead of firing him, the man said he was impressed that Bryce owned his mistake and came with solutions, that most people just make excuses, that this showed real growth. After the call ended, Bryce just sat there stunned, and I realized something had changed between us, that he wasn't the brother who destroyed my stuff anymore, but someone who actually needed my help and could accept it without making it about his disability. 2 months passed like that, him asking for help with work emails, me teaching him basic professional stuff, both of us not talking about how weird this reversal was. Then at Sunday dinner, right as Mom was serving dessert, Bryce cleared his throat and announced he'd been saving money to move out. Mom's fork clattered on her plate, and Dad's coffee mug stopped halfway to his mouth. Bryce kept talking, explaining he'd found a studio apartment near work with 2 roommates who also worked in gaming, guys who didn't care about his IQ scores or that he never graduated, just that he knew every game ever made. Mom started crying, but not the angry tears I expected, more like she was watching her baby bird leave the nest 20 years late. Over the next few weeks, we packed up his stuff together, going through boxes of old games and toys, finding things we'd forgotten existed. He held up our old Dark Souls disc and asked if I remembered helping him beat that one boss, back before everything went bad, back when we were just brothers who played games together. I remembered. We both did. The invitation to Lynn's family's annual company party came addressed to all of us, but this time Bryce would be attending as an employee, not just as my brother tagging along. The night of the party, I watched him practice his presentation about game testing in front of the bathroom mirror, stumbling over words but determined to get through it. At the actual party, he stood in front of 50 people including Mr. Johnson and started talking about bug detection, his voice shaking at first, but then finding its rhythm as he explained how his different way of thinking helped him catch things other testers missed. Mr. Johnson was beaming like a proud father, and afterwards Mr. Williams, the head of testing, pulled me aside to tell me my brother had unique insights, that his perspective was actually an asset because he approached games differently than everyone else. The whole drive home, Bryce kept talking about the different bugs he'd noticed in games over the years and how maybe he could actually be good at something. And for the first time in forever, Mom and Dad were listening to him like he was an adult instead of their broken child. 3 weeks later, we were standing in Bryce's room on moving day, wrapping his gaming posters in bubble wrap while he sorted through old controllers and headsets he'd collected over the years. The apartment he'd found was only 20 minutes away, but it felt like he was moving to another country, and Mom kept stopping to wipe her eyes every time she picked up another box. She finally broke down completely when we were loading the truck, sobbing into Dad's shoulder while saying she'd babied him too long and thought she was protecting him, but really she'd been holding him back all these years. That's when Bryce's new roommates pulled up in a beat-up Honda, 2 guys from the gaming company who'd offered to share their place when they heard he was looking, and they immediately started joking with him about which console was superior while grabbing boxes like they'd known him forever. I watched them treat him like just another 20-something guy moving in with friends, not someone with a disability or special needs, just Bryce, who happened to be really good at finding bugs in games. As we finished loading everything and Bryce was about to get in the car, he pulled me aside and pressed an envelope into my hand, looking down at his shoes while telling me not to open it until he was gone. The transformation from Bryce destroying Chinese books to actually buying replacements with his first paycheck shows such a complete flip in how he sees his brother. The house felt wrong that night at dinner with his empty chair still at the table, like someone had died, except we could still text him, and Mom kept starting to call him for dinner before catching herself. After they went to bed, I finally opened the envelope in my room and found $300 in cash along with a note written in his messy handwriting that said he was the disabled one, but he disabled me too, and he was sorry, and could I maybe teach him some Chinese when he got settled. My hands were shaking as I read it 3 times, then folded it carefully and put it in my desk drawer with my old Chinese materials. A week later, he called while I was doing homework, practically yelling into the phone about how he'd cooked spaghetti for the first time, and it was terrible and stuck to the pot, but it was his terrible spaghetti that he'd made himself without anyone helping. Lynn and I went to visit him the next weekend, and he showed us around the apartment like it was a palace, pointing out his corner with his gaming setup in the kitchen where he'd burned the spaghetti in his bedroom that was already a disaster of clothes and game boxes. His roommates were there playing some new release, and one of them looked up and said, I was the brother who got him the connection, and thanks because Bryce was actually cool and had already found 3 major bugs they'd missed in testing. We all ended up playing together for hours, passing controllers around and arguing about strategies, and Bryce wasn't trying to control everything or prove he was smarter, just sharing what he knew and actually listening when Lynn suggested a different approach to a boss fight. This was who he could have been all along if we hadn't all been so focused on what he couldn't do instead of what he could. If Mom and Dad hadn't wrapped him in bubble wrap and told him the world was too hard for him to navigate alone. 2 weeks after that, Mom and Dad went to visit him for dinner and came home looking 10 years younger, going on and on about how he'd cooked them chicken that was only slightly burned and had shown them his pay stub from his first real paycheck, and how his roommates had said he was already one of the best testers on the team. I started practicing Chinese right in the living room after that visit. My textbook spread across the coffee table while Mom read her magazine on the couch nearby. Nobody complained or made faces or claimed migraines anymore. Sometimes I'd video call Bryce in the evenings and he'd ask me to teach him basic phrases, sitting in his tiny apartment kitchen with his roommate's cat wandering through the background. He was terrible at tones and kept mixing up simple words, but he'd laugh at his mistakes and try again, writing notes in his messy handwriting. At school the next week, I stopped by Mrs. Rodriguez's office and told her everything that had happened since the court stuff. She leaned back in her chair and said something about people needing to hit bottom before they could change, and how our family had found a way through. 3 months passed like that, with Bryce getting better at his job every week, until one Thursday evening my phone rang while I was doing homework. It was Bryce, and he was crying so hard I could barely understand him at first, but then he managed to get out that he'd been promoted to senior tester. His voice cracked when he said they valued his brain, his different brain that noticed things other testers missed. That Sunday we started what became our new tradition, with everyone gathering at our house for dinner. Bryce drove himself over in the used Honda he'd bought with his own money, walking through the door with this confidence I'd never seen before. We ate Mom's lasagna and talked about normal stuff like work and school and the weather. During dinner, Bryce cleared his throat and announced he'd enrolled in online classes. Just basic stuff, he said, wanting to try learning again at his own pace. Dad stood up with his glass and made this short toast about second chances and new beginnings. We all raised our glasses, even Bryce with his apple juice, since he never did like champagne or any alcohol really. Lynn showed up for dessert, bringing homemade cookies she'd baked with her mom. Bryce thanked her in Chinese, butchering the pronunciation completely but saying it with real sincerity. She smiled and gently corrected his tones, and he laughed at himself without any of that old shame or anger. While Mom was cutting the pie, Bryce admitted he might fail the classes, but wanted to try anyway, because failing wasn't the worst thing anymore, not trying was. As everyone got ready to leave and Lynn helped Mom with dishes, Bryce pulled me aside near the front door. He looked at me for a long moment, then said simply that he was grateful for the chance, for my patience, for not giving up on him completely even when he'd been at his worst. I watched him drive away to his own life a few minutes later, while Mom and Dad waved from the doorway like proud parents should. The house felt peaceful now in a way it never had before. I sat down in the living room to practice my Chinese characters while my parents read nearby, nobody claiming territories or keeping journals of grievances or demanding anyone leave. We were still figuring out how to be a family without all the old toxic dynamics, but we were learning together, making mistakes and trying again just like Bryce with his Chinese phrases, building something better one day at a time. Man, I had a blast hanging out and just exploring all this with you today. Seriously, it's been such a fun ride. Can't wait to do it again soon. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.